Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Architecturally Speaking. I'm your host, Ryan Schwartz, and today we're continuing our three-part series based around the Ontario Association of Architects Shift Challenge. So the Shift Challenge is a design competition held every other year where the OAA picks a particular topic to explore and then invites architects registered with the OAA to submit some conceptual design projects addressing that particular topic. So the topic selected for 2025 was titled Reshaping Communities. So the challenge this year was coming up with an architectural solution that starts to rethink our communities and how they're designed. How do we respond to the modern challenges that our cities are facing? And what can be improved to make our neighborhoods and our communities better for everyone? So the hope being that these projects will get shared and start to inform and educate our thinking a little bit so that eventually evolving into real world projects with some positive impact. So a jury then evaluates these anonymous projects and then selects the winners. And today we just happen to have two winners with us today. So we have Jerry Hacker. He's an architect and professor at Carleton University with his project titled Speculative Assemblies, From Pine Needles to Pressed Coffee. Welcome, Jerry.
Hi, thanks so much. Great to be here.
And we also have David DiGiuseppe, an architect representing Q4 Architects and their project titled Designing for Resiliency at Home. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into your particular project, the challenge this year was called Reshaping Communities, and that's a pretty broad topic. So what kind of ideas first went through your mind when thinking about this project and this challenge? Like what comes to mind when thinking about reshaping communities? Maybe David, we'll start with you.
I think it's awesome that the OAA hosts this competition and opens it up with such a broad topic. And reshaping communities, obviously, in the face of climate change, in the face of the current economic crisis, we're thinking right away about the places where people live, mainly, and how we can make those better on a day-to-day basis as architects and advocates of the built environment. And so, I know we jumped right away into looking at climate change and how we can build resiliency to make our communities better. That was the jumping off point, really.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Jerry?
Yeah, I think it's really great that the OAA has these opportunities to maybe just step back and try to imagine the way the world ought to be instead of maybe the way it is. And so that's where my mind went right away with Speculative Assemblies, is sort of looking back, taking a step back from day-to-day practice and even those kind of things, and just, really begin to think about alternative ways of looking at the world, alternative ways of trying to shift the needle just a little bit and sort of imagine different futures, different climate futures, different possibilities. So that's really where my mind went in terms of the call, I guess, if you will. That opened up all sorts of opportunities, I think, to kind of really imagine what is it that makes communities, everything from buildings right down to materials. And so there's and neighborhoods, and a building is part of a neighborhood, and a neighborhood is a part of a city, and then as you zoom in closer, of course, buildings are made of pieces and components, and so it really has this opportunity to be the full spectrum, really. From a single material to the globe in some ways.
So we should dive into your projects here a little bit. If you can take a few moments to kind of walk the audience through your project and tell us sort of what it's all about. David, maybe I'll let you go first.
Sure. So our project's called The Living Core. It's designed for residential housing or a way to rethink the way that we build homes to build in resilience. And especially we're looking at the lens of small town Ontario, what we think of kind of the postcard image of small town Ontario, what attracts us throughout the year to visit these places, to live in these places, and how we can keep them, how we can make them resilient and keep them viable in the face of climate change. And so our project specifically looked at Goderich, Ontario, and the tornado that hit it in 2011, destroying much of the city and some of the historical fabric, and really what makes it such a culturally significant place. And so we've designed a a house that's sort of this duality between what we call a core and a shell. So essentially, the core is the engine of the home. All of your possessions, appliances, building systems are situated in that core. It's protected, somewhat like a bunker. It's a lot more cost is put into that side of the house to make it more resilient. And then the rest of the house is the shell, something that is a little bit more cheaper to build, maybe something that areas of the home that you can sort of allow to be destroyed or be more easily affected by climate change, but it's not going to change your ability to live in the home. And so really designing with that core allows these homes to be resilient, to be built back and hopefully built back better, and allows these communities to survive natural disaster.
That's great. And Jerry, how about tell us a little bit about your project, your team's project?
Yeah. So I think, I think Speculative Assemblies was born really out of one question. And that question was, what if you could plant a building? What would that mean? Both, like, what if you could plant it to grow it? What if you could plant it when it was at the end of its life? And so I really wanted to look at a slightly different perspective of some of the issues of circularity, some of the issues of sort of designing for disassembly, really trying to look at a much broader life cycle of a building. Like if you could plant a building, maybe we'd have to start thinking about its existence 20 years before it even came into being, this kind of thing. And so it really took that as a leaping off point. And then threw in a bunch of other little challenges to it. What if you could design an assembly that was completely disassemblable at the end of its life? What if it could be toxin free? What if it could be constructed from regenerative resources that could also be positioned here in Canada that would replenish themselves over time? Really, and what would that mean? And also opening that up to other underutilized or undervalued waste economies or other streams of resources that aren't kind of mined resources in some respects in the traditional sense of the word. Sorry. And then really kind of work from the ground up and go, what would that mean? Like what would happen? What would change? What would need to be different? Where are the gaps? How would this work in a cold weather northern climate where we need vapor barriers? And what happens to all that stuff, which happens at the moment to be all kind of petroleum based materials. These are all plastics. They're full of bitumen. The way they're produced, and the global supply chains that they participate in. So this was a kind of a questioning of that first and foremost, to just say, what if you could plant a building?
That's pretty interesting. And these two projects, they're quite different, but there's certainly some shared philosophies around the environment and sustainability and human well-being. And it seems like both these projects are sort of ultra realistic, I think, about the sort of the state of our climate and where our world is at. And it's maybe, a slightly pessimistic view, but I think a sort of a realistic view. So why does architecture really need to sort of tackle climate change head on? Like what's at stake here? Why is this so important?
Yeah, I think the built environment is a huge contributor to climate change, and obviously it also provides the places where people find shelter, where they interact with their family, where they hold most of their familial wealth in certain situations where all their friends and family and community live. And so it's imperative to protect that. I think it's sort of fundamental that when we have a place to live, it needs to be stable, it needs to be welcoming, it needs to look good, and it needs to protect and be nurtured by the environment around it. So we need to protect that environment and preserve it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I obviously agree with all of that, and I think something we were trying to crack a little bit too is there's a certain degree of curiosity, I guess, or hopefully curiosity in the project we were working on, and some of that comes, there's a lot of kind of doomsday-ish stuff. Obviously, like in some ways everything's at stake. if like in some ways with climate change, everything's at stake.
Fair
here.
enough.
We're at,
Yeah.
we're at a very particularly precarious moment, it seems, in history. And yet at the same time, I teach at the university and the future architects of tomorrow, let's say, in some respects, right? Aspiring architects and quite frankly, inspiring architects. Like I learn as much from them as they learn from me many of the times. And I think that's really great. But I also think, they sort of, they deserve a chance at curiosity too, that there's a way that we can continue to look at the world in bewilderment and a little bit of awe in some respects. And I think climate change is bewildering. It's so big. It's so big. It's operating at such a massive scale that sometimes it's hard to like dial down, like, what can I do about this? Where's my role in this? How do I imagine alternative futures? And so in some ways, I think the students deserve this kind of chance at curiosity too, to be inspired, to not see it as something that's, the whole sky is falling in some ways, that, what are different ways we can come at this? So everything is at stake, but I also think it's a bit of curiosity towards the bewilderment of it all and the awe of it, but hopefully in an optimistic way too, as opposed to some of the easy road you can fall into a bit more cynical. And I always say I'm not a fan of cynicism. I don't like cynical discussions. I like skeptical discussions. I like things you can be skeptical, but hopefully not cynical in some ways, right? So let's be skeptics and sort of investigate what's possible.
I like that. Yeah, it is a huge problem, and it does seem a little overwhelming at times. But I think you're right. Breaking it down into little sort of bite-sized chunks, like what can I do personally to sort of help? What little pieces can I tackle myself? So we touched on this a little bit, but there's sort of this relationship between the environment and buildings, and the environment impacting buildings, but then also buildings impacting the environment with construction materials and methods. So maybe we should touch on that a little bit. Like, what's the impact of the environment on our buildings, and vice versa? Like, how do our buildings impact the environment? How do we start to look at that relationship?
I think, yeah, they totally go hand in hand. Both impact each other, our buildings, the environment, vice versa. Obviously, in our scheme, we look a lot at the direct impact of natural disaster on the built environment and on our communities. That's quite obvious, like frank and uncomfortable, and really unfortunate, because it can have such a huge impact and lasting impact, and an expensive impact. So I think the environment affects us clearly through natural disaster, through the, especially in the northern climate, just the impact of climate on a day-to-day basis. I don't know, not to get into detail. I think like Jerry's project really addresses this, but in a day, freeze thaw, that can have such an impact uh, on our buildings that keep us safe, and are constantly being put at through stress from the environment. Um, yeah, and vice versa. Obviously, like I said before, we're a huge contributor to emissions, to CO2, to energy intensity, energy use, water use, the built environment. So and natural habitat. So I think, yeah, architecture, we have to keep both things in mind at the same time: our impact on the environment, the environment's impact on ours, and really find solutions in our work through design, through thinking critically and skeptically, as Jerry said.
I think right now, like in the industry for sure, there's a lot of emphasis on carbon, and probably rightfully so, given NASA has released this new composite image of global temperature, right? And we're at 1.47 degrees already above where we were, and 1.5 degrees was this very critical tipping points, it seems like, for warming scenarios. And those are, human caused in many respects. So that idea of carbon is obviously very important. low carbon buildings are, is a big topic, obviously, in the profession at the moment. But I think maybe there's room to expand that too, because I think we're actually not doing a super great job. Sorry, there seems to be some university somebody doing something outside my window.
It's a busy spot. It's a busy place.
Yeah, somebody doing something outside my window, like window washing or something. But nonetheless, the impact of carbon. But we're actually, in some ways, we haven't really figured out a great way to do this. We kind of take some factors when we have different materials, and we kind of mash it all together, and we try to get this number, and this material has this much carbon impact and this one has less. And then somehow we use that as this bar for which materials are good for the environment. But I think what's lacking in that a little bit is the kind of extent of how far these things go, like how entangled we are in such an interconnected global world. And that can be everything from, who's the person in the factory, breathing in benzene when they're making plastic spray foam insulation or something, right? And we tend not to, it's hard, again, the bewilderment of that. Like, it's hard to imagine when we, as architects, specify a material that
It's hard to quantify that. Yeah.
somewhere else, somewhere in the world, somebody is running a machine that's, extracting a resource from the earth and processing it. And, and I think back to a little while ago with the great Zaha Hadid, rest her soul, and when they were building the World Cup stadium for soccer, and she was, there was some uproar over working conditions, for example. And, and she said, well, I can't control the working conditions. I'm just the architect, in some ways. And that's hard to reconcile too, right? But we make these kind of decisions about what we put in buildings. And in some ways, we're complicit. We're ultimately the people who make that giant manual, right? That,
Yep.
That says these are all the things that are going into this building. And the question is, how do we, for me anyways, and for the project I was working on, how do we start to come to better terms with the extent of that? Like the fact that there are exploitative working conditions, the fact that there are, even on the construction site, somebody, has to install this stuff. So they're torching on roof membranes and they're breathing in fumes from 2-ply bitumen-based torch on roof membranes. Like, I don't want to get too into technical weeds, but, like but we don't know how to kind of account that when we say, oh, this is a low carbon building or a low carbon material, in a way, right? Because it's like, how much diesel is in some of those materials that have traveled around the world?
Yeah.
So anyway, so it's a kind of a bigger, broader question for me too, about like, what are the tentacles and how are those tentacles, coming back in to the building itself?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because it is these systems are so big and complicated that it really is difficult to know what the impact is. Some of this, materials or methods, and we're just scratching the surface with things like lead, and these sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call them surface level, but they're pushing things in the right direction and promoting sustainability, but they're not necessarily getting to the heart of things. So do you say that our current built environment and our practices, are they prepared to sort of handle this? And maybe we've sort of answered it already here, but and without being too pessimistic, and if yes, or why or why not, and then sort of how does your project address that?
Well, I think we've come a long way, we should say, being optimistic again in the outlook on this. Like, I've been working in architecture for 15 years about. I'm rather a new licensed architect of 3 years. And when I started working, we were very much talking about LEED as a new thing. And maybe now today we aren't talking about it as much. We have more, some more nuanced ways of thinking about sustainability, maybe. We have more tools, maybe not yet, the perfect tools to really investigate the world that Jerry's describing, this interconnected, sequence from natural resource to built product. We still, as a profession, often rely on spec writers, third party people that are really like involved heavily in system selection rather than specific material selection. Again, like our project was thinking a lot about insurance, insurance in the case of natural disaster, but on a day-to-day basis, we think of insurance and warranty of building products and building systems, and they often, because of client requirement or authoritative requirement, like we're going for best proven, longest lasting, and unfortunately, most of those materials are harmful to the environment, like Jerry was describing. So I think we've come a long way. We're not there yet. And I think we have to do better in certain regards.
I think you brought up the point of insurance. I just want to touch on that before Jerry, you jump in, because I think that's such a good real world example that, climate change is this big, ambiguous thing that's happening outside and it's not affecting you every day. But your insurance premiums are probably going up because of fires and floods and hurricanes and things like that. And that is a real world impact that people can feel, when
Totally.
that bill comes in.
Yeah, totally. I think we were addressing that head on in our project. Obviously, we know what happened in LA with the wildfires, what happened, closer to home, I guess, in Jasper, $1 billion+ worth of damage, people's homes. If people can rebuild, will they be able to rebuild? How long will it take to remediate those sites? But also, like, is there the money to rebuild? And can we actually, through building, hopefully replace some of the cultural capital of places like Jasper? Insurance is a huge deal in the building industry, and it's become a lot more prominent in our day-to-day thinking and in the way that we talk to our clients, not only about the sites they're building in, but also about like individual building componentry.
Yeah, for sure. I love what you're talking about, David, too, in terms of entering the profession too. So I've been at this like 20 years now, and I'm sure David has seen this too. And I haven't had a single client say, give me some like short-term maintenance materials that I want to really look after and care for. Right? I've only had people say like, how do I not touch this for 50 years?
Totally.
And the interesting thing I think that also drives is a particular material philosophy about care and timeline and these kind of things too. So, so you end up with PVC siding and these kind of things that are quite damaging and detrimental, but yet, because they can just sit there for, I don't know, forever, I guess. Like, I don't know if plastic ever goes away. We don't really know if it ever leaves. Right. And so there's a notion of like, if it's durable and long term, somehow that's part of the sustainable conversation too. But I don't know, like we need to maybe reframe that a bit about, if things are more regenerative, they're going to require more care, and that's a different philosophy. So that's one kind of aspect, I think, about time and how that comes into sort of play. And then you're sort of saying, Ryan, are we ready for this, and can we come at it? And that's where I think it's such a big issue as well about all the different people that are involved. I was reading something recently where it said architects are 0.01% of the delivery process of a project, and we are 0.001% of the life cycle, which I think we're more familiar with. But that 0.01 of the delivery process shocks me every time, right? Because we're not in a backhoe digging copper out of a mine or whatever the tools are. We're just not there, right? And our impact is, well, we need electrical wiring in the building, right? And so this huge delivery process. So there's regulatory bodies and there's policy, and so I think to change that, like we all need to come together quickly, right? And it's going to take huge energies, not just from architects, but from policy setters, from industry, from manufacturing, and people sort of have to all get on board together in a way, and that's tricky. So are we ready for that? I think probably not in some ways, right? Because those are massive shifts to systems that are established around the world. And it's like a huge, huge boat with a tiny rudder. And we need to steer away from the iceberg or whatever. But sometimes we're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic a little bit, right? And it's like we can only rearrange the deck chairs for so long before we have to kind of step back and realign, I think, in some ways. So it's complicated. There's no easy solution to this. I'm not purporting easy solutions. I think it's hard work. I think it's optimism. It's people coming together and trying to change that kind of stuff.
So, as architects, how do we help create a sense of urgency there? Because I think that is a really good analogy. If you have this massive boat and we can only control so much, we can steer it 0.1 degree onto course. And how do we sort of get everyone else on board to keep steering the right direction? How do we create that sense of urgency with all the other professions? And this podcast is sort of one good example, but what else can we do?
So I think like we're advocates for the public. That's really an architect's job, fundamentally to some degree. And we have to not only think about the public in terms of like meeting the building code, meeting authoritative requirements, designing great buildings, but also like educating our clients, educating the public, being advocates really also for the world, right? This is the world that we live in. This is the world that we share, that we're designing for. And like advocacy is paramount. I think like Jerry's talking about, it's a big picture. There's a lot of components. I mean, I hate to say it, we've all learned so much in architecture to get to this point, but I mean, we need to even learn even more about the built environment, what goes into our buildings, strategies, methods of design that allow us to gather up this information and apply it in new and really better ways. Really informing our clients is a huge part of that, right? They make the decisions, they set the budgets. It's really us, us applying the rules that they've set into place, and I think we just have to be better in telling them what they can get for their money, how they can be better stewards, how they can be, better landlords, I guess you could say, right? And I think that we do that every day. We have to get better at it. We have to, have more agency, drive the discussion, and hopefully people will align. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's another, like, we're at another tricky point, it seems, in history, because something I study in my sort of academic role, like I have a practice and an academic role, but something, I study the health of the planet, and I study health of human relationships and social interaction and loneliness. And at first, maybe they don't seem connected, but I think they are super connected in a way, because the notion that as we become more reclusive, or we're seeing, if we look around the world, about how people are communicating with each other, how people treat other people's worldviews, every day there's tension with that, right? And
Yep.
and that's an issue, I think, in some ways, when you can't get together to discuss things in a kind of constructive, productive way, and people are sort of in their camp, and they're not going to give up their camp because it's whatever mainstream media is, like whatever the soup du jour is, right, in that kind of regard. But I think it's critical, because I think back to the 80s, when I was a young child, and the ozone hole was like a problem, right? It was like, oh my God, the ozone hole, right? And the world sort of got together, and people, we banned styrofoam containers at McDonald's or whatever, and spray paint cans and CFCs and all this kind of stuff, right? And there was a kind of a global effort towards that. And I was reading, like a few years ago, it's like people are like, yeah, the ozone actually, it's closed up now. And I thought, that's great. Like, we got together, we talked about it, we did something about it, and it worked. Right. And I feel like right now, this, as we become more reclusive, and then it's hard to talk about fundamentally common interests. And by that, I mean like air quality and water quality. And if we can't discuss that, we can't fix it either, or help it, or change it, or move the needle, or whatever, because we're all human relationships are troubled, and that seems particularly fragile at the moment too. So the climate's fragile, the human relationships are fragile, and that fragility is a real issue that's hard to overcome in some respects. And we probably need more like global cooperation towards end solutions, but we just sort of have endless COP conferences. Yeah, and then people just kind of go, I'm not doing that, or I'm not joining in, or our country, we want to protect our economic sovereignty, or whatever the case may be. It's very apparent to us as Canadians right now, that kind of speak as well. So I would just throw that in the mix to the discussion.
Totally. One more thing, Ryan. I think I think the fundamentals of sustainability, if we talk about that in the lens of architecture, like I learned in university, and I think I have to applaud Jerry and his project especially, because even you can see in the Shift booklet, photos of Jerry's work. I think with your students, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, but photos of these students with their models, with their projects, like they're doing actual research into building materials and into new ways of building. And I think that is really the fundamental place where we access, the ability to change minds, create agents of change, and like that. I really think like that's where it begins. If architects are going to have a place and agency in this discussion, the ability to make change, it really happens at the institution, learning the fundamentals of architecture and learning how we build better.
Yeah, and really showing those examples. I think that's a great point, is that you have to go out on a limb maybe and show people, hey, this is a way we can do it that's a little bit different. And it might not be the same way we've been doing it for 100 years, and that's probably a good thing. But sort of setting that example, with your own projects and your own clients and your own house, even, if you're working on your own home. So, I just want to take a step back here, because both projects they're sort of trying to mitigate the negative effects of climate change and materials and things. But it's interesting because they're sort of at different scales, and one is kind of preventative and one's a little bit more responsive. And how I don't know, how do you think about that? Just want to touch on that for a minute, because one is sort of dealing with the materials and the assemblies that we're putting into a project, and then one is kind of dealing with a very acute sort of response to a disaster. So what's your thinking behind that? The sort of prevention and response, and it's just, I guess, a balance between both. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, just to jump back 1 second, because to applaud David as well in the same way, right? Because I think with the work that they're doing too, he's speaking of the students and giving them this opportunity for this experiential learning, and how they take that forward. And then the question is, like, how do those two worlds of practice and scholarship, how do they influence each other in some ways, right? Because then graduates leave here and then they go do work, and they have to do the kinds of work that David is still doing out in practice, right? So, and then the beauty of that is we get to see that worked out in practice, and then it can come back to like the school too, right? And so somehow, sometimes these worlds are separated, like, oh, you're on the academic dark side, and you're on the, whatever. Yeah, it depends on what your perspective is. But I don't see it like that. Like, like those two worlds are influencing. So we need people like David doing these projects too, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's obviously to push boundaries outside of the walls of the institution too is really important there. So So I just wanted to build on that a second, and then sorry, could you just remind me where you wanted to go next?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would just say, yeah, sometimes those two worlds, they maybe don't talk as much as they should, the sort of academic and the private practice. And, there is certainly that dialogue, but it probably could be better. But, just going back to the idea of prevention and response and sort of the two projects and sort of the two different scales, like one, in terms of scale too, in that, materials, and you're talking about sort of the longevity of materials and this health effects of, plastic is off-gassing for 50 years and that effect on human health versus, all right, there's a tornado coming down my driveway right now. How do we deal with that? And just that dialogue between the two, long-term, short-term prevention and response.
Yeah. No, and it's true. Like they're again, like the scholarship practice say, they're not two different worlds, right? The cure and the symptom and the results, they're all
Yeah.
they're all sort of connected, right? So, and I think about that, like, in the world of medicine, people are like, and what is that? Like an ounce of prevention is worth whatever 50 pounds of treatment or something like
Yeah.
that, right? So similarly, we don't maybe think about it that way, but an ounce of prevention goes a long, long way, and I think about that often too, about, we've been talking about energy use today, and I keep, I think about that a lot too, because I think, you know, we're working so hard to, maybe make buildings more efficient, which is important, super important, right? To use less energy and less of that stuff. And I keep thinking, but we're still like maybe on the wrong fuel source. Like if we weren't on that fuel source and the fuels or the energies we were using, if they didn't have these, catastrophic effects that are leading to the tornadoes and these kind of things, like maybe we wouldn't be quite so concerned about how much energy per se, because there's no, like, the impact of that use is less, right? So we're super hyper aware of it because of the thing we're married to at the moment, or wedded to, right? And so breaking some of those dependencies, that goes back to this idea, I guess, too, about prevention, right? And it's like, we have enough sun, enough sun lands on the earth every single day to power the globe's energy needs for a year. And yet we're like, nah, we're not going to do that, or whatever, right? It's like if we just were taking the sun's energy and using it, we wouldn't be so concerned how much we were using, I think, in some ways. Yeah, it is like, like if you're preventing that, then maybe you don't have to build, to manage the catastrophic effects, I guess. So yeah, they're obviously woven together.
Yeah, totally agree. Like, it's, we go back to first principles building design, but it even goes like, even before that, to look at prevention. Like, what's the infrastructure that's in place? Why is this a building site, from, in the first place? Have we serviced it correctly? Um, Prevention, I think, like when we think about prevention in our project, that's the key. It's about building resiliency from day one. Um, Obviously, we don't. When I think I mentioned like that the core, for example, in our project looks like a bunker, but the key of the project is that it's not a bunker, right? Um, the core is a tool essentially to protect the home over time, but really, like, it's designed not to be that. It's designed to be a home from first principles. Like, that's what we're trying to provide to people. And so I think when we think about prevention and resiliency, we have to still have like that end goal in mind. What actually is the space that we're building? It still needs to function as a home. It can't be, I don't think, I don't think it's like the minimum shelter that we designed. Obviously, we could always go back to and rely on that. But that's not actually the case of how people live, and how people live in Southern Ontario in this instance. We need homes. We need homes that meet the marketplace, that allow people to live, that have value, that people rely on throughout their lifetimes. And also, as we say in our project, that have some cultural relevance to the place, and the people and the community around those spaces. So, I think trying to wrap it up around your question. like resiliency, it has to start at the beginning. And it's not just about designing for the effect or the after effect. It's really designing for the steady state condition. That's the key, and hopefully building in the resiliency, the margin that allows that steady state to last as long as possible.
Yeah, and you mentioned location and taking a step back to say is this a good spot to build? And I think that's a really good point. Is both these projects, I think location is kind of an underlying theme too, right? Sort of being hyper local in terms of the threats that you're addressing. If you're living on the coast and there's hurricanes, that's a pretty important focus. Versus you're in an earthquake prone area, something like that. But then also the materials, it maybe doesn't make sense to have marble shipped in from Italy and all the fuel that's burned to get it there and that kind of stuff. So can we just touch on the idea of location and using materials and methods that are kind of local to that area, and dealing with the problems that are local to that area too? What are your thoughts there in terms of the projects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's also, these are awesome. These are such big, such big things to tackle in some way, right? And when you were talking about that, Ryan, immediately my mind also went maybe even one step further back. Do we even need to build anything in the first place? Do we? We might already have enough stuff, right? We have enough. Maybe we have. I know this is again a bit dreaming or whatever, because we are architects and people need schools and hospitals and and things come up, and we are in a profession where we're making those things, right? But I do often wonder if architecture schools, they might have a cultural problem that we make stuff as its fundamental root, we're coming here to make things, right? And we are, in a way, right? We are coming here to make things. I get that. And I've made lots of buildings over my career. But as I, look back, I think, maybe that question needs to be widened. Maybe we have enough stuff already, or we're not using the stuff we have as best as we can, right? And then also going back to this idea of designing for disassembly, right? I think on the other side of the ocean, they're doing a slightly better job than we are too in some of these areas, like buildings as material banks, creating inventories of everything that's already in the buildings we have, so that when they come down, we can
Just reuse it.
mine our own buildings, right? And keep using that stuff. They're full of copper, they're full of things, right? But you have to kind of understand what's there first to use it. So that might even be it might already be here. Your question about shipping marble in a boat, I totally, obviously I'm very sympathetic with that in terms of the project and all. And I'm and maybe the marble's already here. Maybe we don't need to bring it here. I don't know, because we're not doing a great job of sort of tracking what we have and what we might be able to reuse. And then that can build on another conversation of these regenerative practices. How do materials regenerate themselves? Where are they? We have so many potentials for this in Canada, everywhere, straw and all this stuff. But we
We have a lot of stuff here. Yep.
yeah, and we chop it up into tiny little pieces and use it as feed or something, And so we haven't also thought, these regenerative things need an industry and they need a place, and they, and they can be part of that as well, in terms of what you're talking about, I guess, in terms of hyper regional or not. But and then there's a bigger question, kind of prove it a little bit, in some ways, because I think people aren't going to just accept that. Show me that things here are better than things from farther away, right? And there's a architectural practice in the Netherlands called superuse. I don't know if people know this practice or not, but they're always creating a harvest diagram for all of their projects, and where are they harvesting the things from, and where did these, and they're really trying to understand what is the radius of how far am I reaching to get this stuff, right? And can I get it closer? Can I find a cabinetry that's already here? And and they're kind of oh, there's this building being taken down, and all the open web steel joists are perfectly fine. Like, just bring those over to our building and we'll use them. We'll just keep them in longer use. So again, a big conversation about that, but do we have enough stuff? Do we need to build more stuff? Is unbuilding part of the solution, and understanding unbuilding as a way to get at some of this stuff? So anyways, I'll turn it, I'm babbling a little bit, so I'll just.
I think it's all about mindset, especially for architects. We live in a wealthy country. We're very resource rich in this country. We're energy rich in some regard as well, and so I think we just think like it's right there in front of us. Let's take it. Let's use it. Let's make something out of it. But I think it's really about changing our mindset. Like if we look at fashion, for example, like vintage fashion or even furniture. Vintage furniture is in such it's such a hot topic right now. It's in demand. There's vintage stores popping up all over the place, and people are rethinking like about where their clothes come from, for example. Rethinking about the not just maybe the resources that go into that, but also maybe the labor that goes into that. And it's we're supporting maybe not the best labor practices, and really we have to think about that as well in architecture. Like Jared was saying, across the ocean in Europe, adaptive reuse is kind of one of the biggest games in architecture. Renovation is huge all across more established countries, older countries than ours. And so I think like we're getting to that point where it's starkly in front of us that we sort of need to make a change. And maybe it's simply about rethinking how we build our buildings, where we get those resources from, those materials like Jerry's describing. I think that hopefully in a new generation, this new generation that is maybe into more DIY, there's more resources for them to learn about how they can use their hands, how they can apply craft into our buildings and create new things out of old materials and old methods in some circumstance. I think if we can support that, if we can somehow find a framework to apply, I don't know, I guess we have to apply some level of regulation onto it. But if we can figure out a framework to capture the value that's in those materials, that's in those previously used products, then we're going to be on our way to solving some of these issues.
Yeah, it's like when vintage furniture, mid-century modern furniture is popular. We need to make vintage houses popular, and then get the demand there. And I like the idea of a harvest diagram. That just made me think of like a farm to table restaurant. Like, well, we could do like a farm to house sort of, with 100-mile house or something. But
Yes, totally.
I know we can talk about this all day, but I want to be respectful of your time here too. Is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to touch on? I know we've covered a lot, but anything that you'd like to, any sort of parting thoughts to leave with?
I just think jumping off of that last conversation, when we talk about vintage, like our project is yes about creating resilience, this concept of the core and the shell, but really like the impetus is looking at these communities around Southern Ontario, Ontario in general, how fragile they are in a certain lens, and how really like we need to think of new ways to invest in them, both in design and building resilience, but also in preserving them, for the next generation and the generation beyond that. Like we really can't just we can't rely on everybody moving to the city or moving to the suburbs around the city. Like these are hugely valuable places with a lot of human capital, a lot of culture that we should invest in. We should support people moving into these communities and really staying in these communities by building the right type of housing there and the right type of services and commercial institutional spaces there. We have to find a way to really preserve these in order to preserve, Ontario, the place that we love, and the people in this province, really.
Yeah, and maybe like speed is a bit at the heart of this little chat we're having at the end. David was talking about fast fashion too, and shifting that, and we look at architecture, and we sort of participate in that world in some ways. And like we kind of we get to that stage of a building where it's a little bit like going shopping. Like when you're specifying, you're like, oh, there, I'll just take that tile, and I'll take that, and I'll take this toilet. Oh, that thing looks, oh no, that toilet's a bit different than that one, and we're lost in a little bit of that world as architects sometimes. And I think, then there's also like the instantaneity or like instant, like we live in a fast world, like fast stuff, fast information, fast things now, information quickly. And our profession is like this too. I think, you get a project and a client, I want the drawings in 4 weeks, and I want the design done, and I want the construction drawings in 3 months after that, and I want a shovel in the ground in 8 months. And like, can you even know a place? Like, can you really know a place like in 3 weeks to kind of come up with a design? Like, really? Do you know like the human and non-human species of that place and what's being disrupted? And so we're also propelled, right? Because we're also in this kind of service industry, where people hire us and they're getting a service, and time is of the essence, and time is money, and time, and it goes on and on and on. But it has a lot, I think, to do with speed and the way we come at the world, right? And so, like, a slowing down might be beneficial. Like,
Take a breath. Yeah.
it's optimistic, or maybe I'm a dreamer, or whatever, or it's a dreaming thought. But it's like pacing ourselves a little bit can also probably do us a wonder of good in some ways, right? And that might start to go, what are the implications of this? If I have a little bit more time to understand it, I have a little bit more time to prepare it, then that would be beneficial, right? So I think we are part of that world. We treat building specs like shopping. We have lunch and learns, and people are coming in and they leave a manual. Not so much manuals anymore. I'm dating myself, but it's all online now. But your kind of manufacturer's website. Ooh, that's a nice light fixture. Ooh, that one's really thin. And it's like buying an iPhone or something, except it's not. It's like that stuff has huge tentacles everywhere. So it's a hard world to live in. We click and shop and sweep, and things come to our door. And there it is. And it's like, wow, this is a disconnect that probably needs to be rethought in some way, in many ways, architecture, society, and all those kind of things. But huge, huge interconnected global problem that, quite frankly, is bewildering. And it's hard to imagine how to break some of these chains, right? And some of the things we're enmeshed in. So that's maybe maybe I'll just throw that in there too.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. It kind of wraps it up. Take a step back, take a breath, and it goes back to what we were talking about before. It's like, maybe educate your client, take that moment to do your part, to sort of steer them in the right direction. Say, well, you have to be this fast, you have to pick that material, and sort of, doing our public advocacy part. So that's a good closing thought. So I definitely encourage those people listening to check out the OAA website and search for the 2025 Shift Challenge. There you can find these 2 winning projects that we've been talking about, learn a little bit more about those. And you can find some great images and photographs that illustrate those projects as well. They're definitely worth checking out. If you made it this far and you've been listening this whole time, you have to go take a look for sure. So visit visit oaa.on.ca to check those out. So that's oaa.on.ca. And thanks for listening or watching if you're following the OAA's YouTube channel. If you're enjoying Architecturally Speaking, leave us a quick review, share it with your friends or a colleague. This helps us create more episodes in the future. And I mentioned the website. There's plenty of other resources there for architects and the general public alike. So if you're interested in learning more about architecture in your own community or your own neighborhood, just search for the Ontario Association of Architects. And that will do it for today. So until next time, I'm your host, Ryan Schwartz, and this has been Architecturally Speaking. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.